Let's bring in right now Ambassador McFaul. He is also in Helsinki. Mr. Ambassador, I'll ask you the same thing. What should Donald Trump be trying to get right now from Vladimir Putin, or what should they talk about? But before you answer that question, you obviously know Vladimir Putin better than most, not personally, but you've studied him more as ambassador to Russia from the United States, and you also know the country better than most of us. It seems that Vladimir Putin, in the mind of many Americans, has been reduced to a two-dimensional character over the past several years, and Russia, our view of Russia, also a bit more two-dimensional than perhaps it should be. Why don't you give us insights, a little more insight into Russia right now, Vladimir Putin, his hold on power, what he is concerned about domestically, what he is concerned about internationally, and what we should be concerned about.
Well, Joe, so yeah, we're not Facebook friends, at least to the best of my knowledge, but I have known Vladimir Putin for a long time, and I've participated in a half a dozen of these summits with various President Obama and other officials with Vladimir Putin. Where he is right now, I think he's feeling pretty confident. He has a firm grip on power at home. There are no challengers at home. He's just had a fantastic World Cup where the whole world saw Russia from a different side. And he's now engaging with President Trump, who's coming in at a very weak point. He's arguing with his allies. He's calling his allies a foe, by the way. The EU consists mostly of NATO allies. He's calling our friends foes. And so I think he's feeling pretty confident going into this meeting right now with President Trump.
David Ignatius, I'll ask you the same thing based on what you know. What is Vladimir Putin's standing in Russia right now? What are his chief concerns? What should be our chief concerns?
Well, he's obviously personally popular, and that's especially true after the World Cup, which was a celebration of the Russia that Putin wants to display to the world. He still is stuck with essentially a one commodity economy, but he's helped in that by his new working alliance with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis now speak of something they call OPEC Plus, which is the traditional Arab-led OPEC plus Russia. So Putin has some interesting new allies. Final point I would make as we talk about the agenda, Syria is a key part of Vladimir Putin's foreign policy. It was a decisive intervention, and it's been very successful in the sense of consolidating power for the Assad regime. It's now a commonplace to say that Assad has won, and it's also a fact that the U.S. has basically acceded to that, no longer resisting. And the key ally that Putin has had in shaping that diplomacy over the last couple months, interestingly, is Israel. Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, has a very good working relationship, from everything we can tell, with Putin. So Putin comes to this summit meeting with Trump with more cards than you might think. He does have popularity at home in a world of somewhat recovering oil prices. He's got a little more money to work with. He's gone through the worst of the period of sanctions without terrible damage to the Russian economy. And as I said earlier, I think for Putin, the theme presumably is, let's let bygones be bygones. Let's turn the page now. You, Mr. President, see Russia in a different way. You're not caught the way your predecessor Barack Obama was in criticism of Russia. Let's walk into the future together, try to cooperate on arms control, other issues. So I think that's probably the tone we're going to see.
We're looking at pictures of a meeting earlier in Helsinki, Finland, of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump when they first met. Gave brief opening statements. Bill Neely of NBC News noted that Vladimir Putin came prepared with notepad and pen. Donald Trump, not so, for their one-on-one meeting where there will be no note takers, other than, it appears, Vladimir Putin. Let's go to Moscow right now and talk to Richard Engel and ask Richard, what Richard, do the Russians want out of this meeting with Donald Trump? What is Vladimir Putin's strategic goal?
So strategically, I think Russia feels, as you were just talking about with David Ignatius and Ambassador McFaul, very confident right now. As you've said numerous times, they had a successful World Cup. The whole world's attention was focused on Russia, and the overwhelming majority of the coverage was positive. President Trump went through Europe like a bulldozer, blasting NATO, blasting the EU, and is now showing up to meet with Vladimir Putin, even though this indictment, which has just accused Russian intelligence officials of carrying out Watergate against the U.S. elections, the meeting is still going on. So strategically, Russia's feeling in a very good place. Now it's about the tactics. What will they specifically ask for in this meeting? And if you look at the statements that have come out of the Kremlin, even this morning, it seems like they might have specific asks regarding Syria. There are about 2,000 U.S. special forces in Syria. Russia doesn't want them there. Russia backs the government of Bashar al-Assad, and those 2,000 American special forces who've been primarily fighting ISIS, but also helping Kurdish fighters, are seen as getting in the way of Russian influence in that country. So what Russia will likely offer is, Russia will promise to lower Iran's influence in Syria. In exchange, your troops have to either leave or stop being quite as active as they have been. And the question is, can Russia really even deliver on that? Will Russia even deliver on that? Is the specific ask just to reduce the U.S. footprint in Syria? Also likely, we're understanding specific asks regarding NATO. While NATO has taken a bruising and a battering from statements, we'll see if there are specific asks that Russia doesn't want NATO exercises to continue right on its border. So I think strategically, Russia's in a good place. Now they're going to come in with a notebook full of things that might seem minor to President Trump, like those military exercises that got canceled in South Korea, but which to Russia, or to South Korea in that case, or to North Korea, are a very, very big deal.
All right, Richard Engel in Moscow, thank you so much for those insights. We greatly appreciate it. Let's go to Ambassador McFaul right now, back in Helsinki. Mr. Ambassador, we didn't really comment yet, didn't hear your insights yet on Donald Trump's continued attacks of NATO, Donald Trump's continued attacks of the European Union. When asked who America's chief foe was, he brought up the European Union first. That must be music to Vladimir Putin's ears. As one commentator, a public opinion leader in Russia, said on Russian television last week, that's something that even the Soviets weren't able to achieve, but now they've achieved it through Donald Trump.
Yeah, Joe, it's just really disappointing. The EU is not our foe. That's ridiculous. Most of the countries of NATO are also in the European Union. They are our allies and partners. Number two, the president also tweeted that America is at fault. Blame America first for the tensions in U.S.-Russian relations, not mentioning the fact that Russia annexed territory in Crimea and started and sparked a war. 10,000 people have died in eastern Ukraine. Not mentioning that he supported this brutal dictator in Syria where 500,000 people have died. And not mentioning the fact that he violated our sovereignty in 2016. So all of those things, in my view, are the reasons why there's tension in U.S.-Russian relations. And for President Trump to just insinuate, as he just did in his initial remarks today, well, bygones, let's just forget about all that stuff and let's move on because I really want to have a great relationship with you, Putin. That is just not serving America's national interest, in my view.
No. And, of course, framing his opening statements with congratulations for a World Cup well run. Not exactly what is on the hearts and minds of not only many Americans, but also a lot of Europeans in democratically elected countries across that continent.
Joe, just to add to that, just to add to that, remember the things he didn't mention. He mentioned arms control. He threw in China out of the blue. We're going to talk about China, but he didn't mention Ukraine. He didn't mention Syria, and he didn't mention the Russian intelligence officers who interfered in our election in 2016, setting the agenda for the meeting. The things that he didn't say were really striking to me.
Again, it did not mention that interference, despite the fact that the man that he picked to oversee America's intel community just this past weekend said that what Russia did was an attempt to undermine American democracy on a daily basis. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. Peter Baker would like to thank you as well for being with us. Greatly appreciate both of your time. And right now in Helsinki, the president and Vladimir Putin are behind closed doors in their one-on-one conversation. That meeting will be expanded later, and then we'll have a longer joint press conference between the two leaders of Russia and the United States. And our coverage on Morning Joe will continue in a moment. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.